The Summer Games Minute, brought to you by Mass Mutual. For most professional athletes, versatility means they can play a few different positions in a single sport. For Babe Dietrichson-Zaharias, versatility means dominance across the entire spectrum of sport. In the 1932 Summer Games in Los Angeles, Zaharias won gold in the 80-meter hurdles and the javelin throw, plus she got a silver in the high jump. Running, throwing, jumping wasn't enough for Babe, so she became a competitive billiards player, then jumped into professional golf, winning 10 major championships, all the while making a few pitching appearances in Major League Baseball spring training games. Mass Mutual understands the nuances in how women want and need to manage their finances. With quality product solutions and guidance, a Mass Mutual financial professional can help you plan for both short-term and long-term money goals. Learn more and get started at massmutual.com.
As you've probably heard by now, we've teamed up with BetMGM this season. We'll be using BetMGM lines to make all of our picks, and we'll have special offers for our listeners each week. If you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager with BetMGM. Here's how it works. Download the BetMGM app and sign up using bonus code The Athletic. Make your first deposit of at least $10. Place your first bet on any game and claim your voucher for a 1-year subscription to The Athletic. See BetMGM.com for terms. U.S. promotional offers not available in D.C., Mississippi, New York, Nevada, Ontario, or Puerto Rico. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Available in the U.S. Call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369 in New York. Call 1-800-NEXT-STEP in Arizona. 1-800-327-5050 in Massachusetts. 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa. 1-800-270-7117 for confidential help in Michigan. 1-800-981-0023 in Puerto Rico. First bet offer for new customers only in partnership with Kansas Crossing Casino and Hotel. Don't forget, if you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
The Athletic.
Hello and welcome, and thanks for joining us on this extremely special episode of the Race IndyCar podcast. Around this time, during the month of May and the Indy 500, we tried to take a look back at a special storyline from the history of the race or the championship and try to shine a light on anniversaries and special events that we want to look back on and take a look at. This week, we've got a very special episode for you. 25 years on, Kenny Brack, the 1999 Indy 500 winner. He didn't know it was 25 years since his Indy 500 win in 1999 until just a couple of days ago when someone alerted him to that fact at the Speedway. He's going to join us on this very special episode to talk about how a failed bid to get to Formula One ended in him joining the IRL, an unusual championship for him to join based on the fact that it was an all-oval championship at that point, and how he became its biggest success story from Sweden, Formula One to IRL and ovals, and eventually the 1999 Indy 500 win. We won't just stop there though. On this episode, we'll look into Brack's career in even more detail, negligible amount of 1999 discussion based on the interview time we had with him, and we wanted to address so many different parts of his career, so we'll definitely get into those. First up, you're going to hear from Matt Beer from the race. He's going to talk about CART and IRL, the split, and the context of the period in which we find the 1999 Indy 500 win. Matt's an expert on this topic. He knows everything there is to know about CART and IRL at this time, and he's also part of the MotoGP podcast with the race as well. A very safe pair of hands for us to join. Then we'll head over to join Kenny Brack talk about 1999 and the rest of his career. I'm sure a lot of you at this point are thinking about his crash. It's one of the first things that comes to memory. We'll get into that as well. And yeah, talk a bit more about his career in general. And then the third and final section will be with Matthias Persson, who works with Felix Rosenqvist and is a journalist in his own right in Sweden. He's just started his own podcast in Swedish on all things motorsport. He's going to talk to us about what happened after that 1999 win, what Kenny Brack's win did for motorsport in Sweden, not just IndyCar and IRL and CART, but the wider motorsport landscape in general as well. Some of his memories from the past and how Kenny Brack has influenced motorsport in Sweden and how Kenny has almost inspired some of the modern day performances that we've seen from Marcus Ericsson and Felix Rosenqvist. So a packed show to get into this week. We're really excited to have Kenny Brack on the show with us, and we'll get to him very soon. But first, we're going to head over to Matt Beer.
Live from the world's greatest racecourse, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, the Pep Boys Indy Racing League takes to the air with coverage of the 83rd Indianapolis 500. The Pep Boys Indy Racing League drivers vie for the richest purse in auto racing, over $8 million.
Matt Beer, thanks so much for joining the Race IndyCar podcast, taking a huge demotion from your usual job as chief of the MotoGP podcast that everybody should go and listen to, and that we quite often plug randomly on our podcast because JR's a massive MotoGP fan and occasionally likes to dig into the storyline surrounding MotoGP. So it's great to have you on. Thanks for joining us.
No, it's a pleasure. It's a novelty to be on this side of it all. So yeah, no thank. And I, when I'm on Bring Back V10s, our Retro F1 podcast, I shoehorn in any tangential mention of mid-90s IndyCar racing I can. Whereas this time, there's no need to be sly about it. I'm literally here to talk about mid-90s IndyCar racing. So it's perfect.
Yeah, so you're kind of moonlighting as our late 90s IndyCar expert in this sense. So I guess let's get into it, because there's no need for us to beat around the bush or try to drum up any kind of headlines here. It all does the work for us. There's definitely no need to embellish anything here. So we'll jump straight into it with the split. Can you explain to the listeners who aren't familiar with the split or are coming to this a little bit cold and not having thought about IRL and CART for a long time now, give us a little bit of a flavour of where we're at in 99, what's gone on in the years previous, and the context around the Indy 500?
Well, okay, this is the most broad brush, quick recap of the split that I can come up with. John Arievich has written a whole book about the split, which is well worth checking out for the full in-depth story, and many good people have written many thousands of words about it over the years, but I'm going to try and do it in a couple of minutes. So effectively, early 90s, what's now IndyCar, the equivalent then was the IndyCar World Series run by CART, Championship Auto Racing Teams, which is basically the most powerful, all the teams, but led by the most powerful teams running the championship. Showpiece race was the Indy 500, just like it is now, except that had its own organisation and its own setup. So effectively, you had a thriving IndyCar series, but the biggest race on that calendar was sort of effectively, well, it was owned by somebody else. That person was Indianapolis Motor Speedway president Tony George, and in the early 90s, at a time when CART was really strong, Nigel Mansell brought so much attention to it, the field was getting more international, the racing was incredible, grids were packed. Tony George made a move to set up a breakaway series based around the Indy 500. His philosophy was that IndyCar was getting too far away from its roots around open wheel American races, people coming through from the short oval scene, that the big teams now had too much of a spending advantage, the budgets were out of control, the calendar, which was a mix of road, street courses and ovals, was too far away from IndyCar's roots. George proposed all oval series with the Indy 500 as its showpiece, and a whole different set of technical regulations, much lower cost, which he felt was the way forward. Now, that's the philosophy, whereas the CART philosophy was actually, we're doing fine with our very international, very varied series. That's the philosophical difference. The main thing this was a power struggle, because you had a circuit that felt it had the biggest race on the calendar and a championship that was kind of diminishing the importance of that big race. And both sides felt they had a much stronger hand than they really did. Tony George and Indianapolis thought CART would inevitably fold because the Indy 500 was so important. CART and its leaders thought the IRL, the Indy Racing League, which was what George's series was going to be called, would just go away because their teams would all stick with them and were so powerful, and the racing would be so much better and the field so much higher quality that Tony George would fall back in line. and it would all be over. Neither side was anywhere near willing to back down, and things got much more entrenched when, first of all, Tony George insisted that if you wanted to be part of the Indy 500, you had to contest the previous 2 IRL rounds, and then you'd be guaranteed one of 25 spaces on the grid. So only 8 spaces on the Indy 500 grid would be kind of open to any entrant. So you basically had to be part of the whole IRL or stand a very strong chance of not even getting to the field at Indy. And in response to that, CART scheduled a race directly clashing with the Indy 500, which are called the US 500 at Michigan. So the two organisations very quickly went into a position where there was no hope of peaceful coexistence. You weren't going to get people contesting some IRL races, contesting some CART races, all coming together for the Indy 500. It was all-out war, and neither side was going to back down, and they just battered each other in that sense for a few years. And in the early part of that, you looked at the quality of the IRL racing and the quality of the field, and you thought, this hasn't got hope. But the Indy 500 had such luster to it. Really, all the manufacturers, all the sponsors wanted to be at the Indy 500. It didn't really diminish that much, even with most of the big teams and drivers not there. So by 1999, which is the main chat in this podcast, even some of the initial stalwart CART insistence were kind of going, we need to find a way to get back together. A lot of the sponsors, a lot of the manufacturers were like, we've got to be at Indianapolis. And things were starting to thaw a tiny bit. But for the previous few years, it had been all-out aggression, basically. And it actually go quite a few more years with all-out aggression before things finally got back into a sane, unified series with what had then become Champ Car, which was what CART became after it actually ended up bankrupt, folding back into the IndyCar series, and Peace breaking out finally in 2008. So that's the split in as quick a recap as I can get it, basically. One big power struggle between two sides that were just not willing enough to compromise. Yeah, have I done an okay job of that?
Yeah, A+. Very considering the time constraint that you're being boxed into by me here, that's a fantastic effort. I think the way to kind of think about this now maybe is like, imagine that Ganassi and Penske are not at the Indy 500 and competing in a separate IndyCar championship. Like the thought of that for, I don't know, an 18-year-old coming into IndyCar racing now, having any of that experience of the split, that would just be the most bonkers and crazy situation to even imagine. You wouldn't even think about, the likes of Ganassi, Penske, maybe like McLaren you would include in that bracket now if it happened. If it happened now, you just wouldn't expect any of that to kind of occur. So an amazing situation, and you're really right to point out the fact that if you look back at some of the races now, especially some of the early races, that you wonder if the quality was enough to kind of keep that series going, and you kind of look back at it and think, not really sure about that.
I don't think there's any uncertainty about it. You look at the early IRL grids, and it's just like, no. I mean, the big thing it had going for it was it did bring Tony Stewart into the American racing mainstream. He was one of the early IRL champions, and was clearly a class apart from a lot of the field early on, and proved his quality in that amazing NASCAR career he had. But if it hadn't been, the idea of behind the IRL was to get people like Tony Stewart into single-seaters, not straight off to NASCAR. But because the split weakened everything so much, there was no keeping him. He was going to a better quality championship with a higher profile. At least he got some success, some major IndyCar success in terms of an IRL title along the way. But really, the grids, I don't want to insult any drivers who were there, and I certainly don't want to insult someone like Buddy Lazier, the first IRL Indy 500 winner, who did that effectively with a broken back, still in absolute agony from a crash a couple of months beforehand. But in normal circumstances, someone like Buddy Lazier was never getting anywhere near an Indy 500 win. I'm pleased he got it because it was such a heroic performance. But on pure, his standing in IndyCar and CART at the time, that's not someone anywhere near the front of the grid. But this is where I think it's worth bringing in the guy you're going to be chatting to in a minute, Kenny Brack, because for me, Kenny Brack arriving in the IRL, I'm not going to suggest for a moment that Kenny Brack was the person who set things back on the path to eventual peace, but everyone thinks about Ganassi bringing Juan Pablo Montoya over for the 2000 Indy 500 and winning it as like a really big moment in teams coming back to Indianapolis. I think Kenny Brack arriving in the IRL, having come very close to the Formula 3000 title, having come very, very close to Formula 1 drives, there's a very realistic alternative universe in which Kenny Brack is Damon Hill's Arrow's teammate in F1 in 97. And given that Pedro Diniz was out qualifying Hill occasionally, and guaranteed Kenny Brack would have done. So, this is the guy who would have been a very serious F1 driver. And when his options in F1 dry up before he even gets on the grid, he tries out the IRL and is an instant success. And for me, Brack arriving was the first sign of someone of that sort of European pedigree thinking, no, this championship is worth a go. And his presence I do think it brought more attention to the IRL as something that wasn't just this curious, strange backwater that had been set up to kind of prove a point and win a power struggle. It was actually a series that international drivers could be considering. He wasn't the only one coming over. Another Formula 3000 frontrunner, Laurent Redon, came over as well, but achieved nothing like Brack's level of success or longevity. Brack opened the door to make the IRL more seriously worth considering for international drivers, definitely.
He's definitely, if you draw up his kind of CV on a piece of paper, he's definitely more suited to kart. And at the time, he was in the kart paddock as well as the IRL paddock, trying to drum up a seat for 97. And I guess it's interesting that he ended up in IRL because he's so, he hadn't done a lot of, he'd done a little bit of racing in America in the Saab base series and some other bits and bobs, but I don't think anyone was expecting him to show up and do a full oval championship and be successful in that context. And kart on paper looks much more like something that Brack would go into as a European based driver when that championship was flourishing for international drivers as opposed to North American drivers, whereas IRL was obviously the opposite, where it was mostly dominated by American drivers doing the ovals. So yeah, really interesting kind of juxtaposition of situations going on there where he ends up being the one who's in IRL and suddenly successful. I think it's his results, obviously, you kind of touched on them initially there. I know you've been watching back some of the races and stuff. He was obviously really, he was leading a lot of his initial oval race. And yeah, his switch to Foyt really unlocked everything for him, really, in terms of being able to fight for the championship in 98. But yeah, just from his results perspective, it's quite unusual to see, I guess, a driver going over to, if you think about the European-based drivers going to kart, they've obviously got some road courses and street courses in there to kind of get themselves up to speed and kind of bed into the championship a little bit, learn their teams and stuff like that. Whereas with IRL, there's no hiding for Kenny Brack. He's going straight into a full oval series. So quite surprised how well he did straight away there.
Yeah, really impressive as well. I'd forgotten quite how good his early races were. The fact he was leading, like you say, much of his debut before eventually crashing out. I think his CV would look even better if the IRL hadn't been quite so random at that point. It was in the early years of them introducing their own rules package, normally aspirated engines with Oldsmobile and Nissan Infinity Power, very different to what kart had. A chassis formula which, let's try not to be too insulting here, but some of the ugliest, most ponderous looking American single seaters you've ever seen. It was the IRL's early rules package did not do it many favors, but he was up against drivers with so much oval experience, and he took to it straight away and was very impressive. And they had massive engine reliability problems when he first arrived at the start of 97 across the whole field. So many races were just yellow after yellow and car after car blowing up. It took a while for this rules package to settle down, and I'm certain he would have far more wins to his name than even what he has if it hadn't been a little bit of a lottery at the time. But in terms of oval racecraft and just getting straight in there with people like Tony Stewart, who had grown up entirely on ovals, yeah, Brack had no problems. And I think the fact he ended up in the IRL rather than kart is indicative of the fact that by 97, actually, it was getting quite hard to get a kart seat. Really, you had to have a pretty big reputation or bring a pretty big budget. And this is something that the IRL did use against kart occasionally. There were an awful lot of European drivers, whether it was Formula 3000 graduates or jobless F1 drivers, who were like, oh yeah, kart's great, look at what Alex Zanardi's doing, let's go there. Couldn't find an open door for them. So, and a lot of those then didn't look at the IRL. Kenny Brack did, put himself very strongly in the kart shop window. He does eventually get to kart, and I feel like almost from the moment he led that first IRL race, there was a rumour every week about what kart team was going to sign him, because it seemed as a matter of time before he was taken back to the glorious land of road and street courses. But, he stayed there for 3 years, won the championship, won an Indy 500, really proved himself as an oval racer. and then was able to walk into a very good kart seat with Rahal and be instantly competitive. So in the end, he played it pretty well.
I get the feeling that Kenny feels like maybe people point to his Indy 500 win and his crash later on in his career as the kind of two defining moments of his career, and that they maybe don't pay so much attention to the kind of bits before and in between. So it's really nice that we've been able to get through some of the results there and kind of contextualize his early career a little bit as well, because I know he's obviously famous for that 1999 win, and obviously his return from injury from 2003 to 2005. I guess you were working and around at that point, so you must remember that being a big story of him like trying to work and part of his rehab, come back in 2005 to the Indy 500. I guess that must have been something you were kind of covering or at least familiar with at the time.
Yeah, I was definitely on the Autosport website news desk around that time. That shunt he had, I'm not surprised it sticks in people's minds, because it was one of there was some horrible aerial crashes around that time, and his was one of the most sickening to watch. And it was at a time as well when his career had taken a little bit of a stumble. After a really strong start in kart, he'd ended up back in the IRL, and it just cost him all his career momentum. And I'm certain he would have been an IndyCar champion again had it not been for that crash. And probably an Indy 500 win actually would have been even more likely with the team he was with at the time. So there was definitely more success to come in his career that crash denied him the chance for. And it was so good that he did get back behind the wheel again, even if it wasn't to the standard and to the sort of success he'd been accustomed to before. But I think one of the things I remember most about Brack's career though is just how quickly he was so on the pace in kart, and how much he impressed with it was with Rahal he joined there, wasn't it? An instant front runner, considering he hadn't had recent road course experience, and pretty close to winning a title there as well. He's definitely the crash truncating his career like that means I think he gets underestimated quite a lot when you're kind of drawing up a list of like the greatest split era drivers almost. But this is someone who should be up there with, probably not like with a Zanardi in terms of impact, but certainly should be talked about in the same breath as like a Sebastian Bourdais, as someone who could have won multiple titles. So yeah, a great driver, and a really important part of the story who often gets forgotten when you're looking back at really significant split drivers and split results.
You mentioned him being close to kart success, and it was, I guess, coincidentally the road course and street course form that kind of let him down in his battle with the late Joe de Ferran. So kind of an interesting back to front finish from the podcast there of him going over and being unusually kind of going into the oval situation, and then kind of struggling a little bit more on the road and street courses compared to the start of his American career, I guess.
Well, I think as well, he was up against Penske as well, which was a really still at that point a tall order, because Penske was so strong once it got its hands on Reynard chassis and Honda engines with Gilles de Ferran and Helio Castroneves for 2000. It became a super team again after several years in the wilderness. And for Brack to come as close as he did with Rahal, which was a great team but not a powerhouse team, to beating Penske to a championship was super impressive. I'm not surprised he had to rely on oval racecraft, because on road, the speed of that Penske package on road courses in particular in Castroneves' hands was phenomenal in that time.
You know we love talking stats here at The Athletic. Here's one that's super simple to remember. Discover automatically doubles the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cashback Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. That's right, you could put it towards some memorabilia you've had your eye on, or treat yourself to a premium sports network. You earn and Discover doubles. See terms at discover.com/creditcard.
We'll get back to the pod in a moment, but first of all, let me tell you about Grammarly. Email, Google Docs, Slack, you write across multiple platforms and places during your workday, so delivering consistent, high-quality communication everywhere is key. Grammarly is an AI writing partner that helps you get work done faster with high-quality writing for better projects, proposals, presentations, and more. Best of all, Grammarly works where you work, so you can get more done no matter what tools you use. As a journalist and podcast host, I'm constantly writing and rewriting copy and drawing up scripts. It's part of the job, and Grammarly helps make it faster. It's got some really cool features like tone suggestions to help you strike the right balance between direct and friendly in work emails. Plus, Grammarly has a ton of other great features like advanced spelling, grammar, punctuation, and conciseness suggestions to ensure your writing is professional, mistake-free, and clear. Get AI writing support that works where you work. Sign up and download for free at grammarly.com/podcast. That's GRAMMARLY.com/podcast. Easier said, done.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
So, with that handy insight from Matt Beer on this period, I feel like we can fire into an interview with the man himself, Kenny Brack, and get deep into that 1999 Indy 500 win, what it did for Kenny's career, what it did for him afterwards, and how he spent his time since, and kind of come full circle. You'll learn a lot about Brack's relationship with Rahal in this topic of conversation and interview next. And he's back there helping out the drivers for this year's Indy 500. So we'll talk to him a little bit about that as well. So without further ado, let's head over to Kenny Brack.
Back to green flag racing. Kenny Brack will lead them into one.
Indeed he will. They went 3 wide momentarily. They had to move around the lap car number 20 of Tice Carlson. Now they're into the second corner already. Kenny Brack cleanly in front, leading a single file line of race cars back to full speed. Brack in front of the race, heading to 3. And
Kenny Brack, welcome to the Race IndyCar podcast. I'm sure on days like the last couple of days, you're probably not so missing being in the car with all the rain and the waiting around that you would have had to have done if you were in the car back in the day.
No, this is it's for the drivers. It's quite how do you say, nerve-wracking. You know, they wanna drive, they want to get the feel of the car, they want to develop the car, and qualifying's coming up, and then you have rain interruptions, and then you have a little bit of dry running, and then you have rain, and so it's a bit easier when you stand on the sidelines when it's like that, for sure.
Yeah. Well, let's go back a little bit into your career and talk a little bit about specifically 25 years ago. I don't want to remind you that it's been a little while since you won the Indy 500, but it's such an incredible occasion and a great anniversary to talk about that race and what it did for your career. But first of all, I wanted to ask you about how you kind of got into IRL at the time, because you'd obviously come off being very close to winning the International Formula 3000 title in 96, and then you decided to go to IRL, which was all ovals at the time. So that must have been quite a shock to the system for you to make that move. And what was the kind of thinking behind that move at the time? Was it just the best offer you had on the table, or what do you recall of that situation?
Well, it was, I came up through the ranks, and I struggled quite a lot through my career, and I made a couple of really important choices in the road I took,
Mm-hmm.
And one was, I learned early on that it's no point competing unless you have the car to win and the team to win.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was one thing that stuck with me. And when I I signed a test contract in Formula One, and parallel with the Formula 3000 campaign with Tom Walkinshaw, and he was the team principal of Leisure F1 at the time. I did have 2 other, I had an offer from McLaren, I had an offer from Benetton, but I chose the Leisure because I thought that as a middle of the road team, I felt the driver lineup was, not bad, but not super good either. And the deal I made was a test contract for the first year and a guaranteed race seat for the next year if I was competitive on lap times when we did testing. So I thought that'd be perfect for me because I know I can be competitive on lap times, and so that was the best, I thought, offer I had on the table at the time, because McLaren had Mika and David, and they were, obviously performing well. And in Benetton, I can't remember who drove there back then, but it was similar, good lineup and all that stuff. It was harder to see how you could make it into a race seat, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
But then, about a month into the testing program, Tom got kicked out from Ligier, and then he bought Arrows, and now everything changed because Arrows was the worst team on the F1 grid at the time. And I said to Tom, maybe we should, just forget about this. And he said, no, we still can do it, and blah blah blah. And we did test. I did do a few tests with the team, but it was, the resources weren't there to do any good in it, I just felt that it was not for me. So I resigned from that role, basically. And then I went to the States. So that's how I ended up in America. And obviously I didn't have a ride. So, luckily I'd been here in America like in 93, a few years earlier, and I ran Barber Saab, and I won that championship. And I sent faxes back then to all the team managers and owners and stuff, so they knew who I was, but they didn't have any rides when I arrived in 1996. So I just hung around all the kart tests, all the Indy Racing League tests, and hoping, and then at one point, there was a driver, Davy Jones. He had a bad accident in Orlando, and Rick Gallis contacted me, who owned the team, and said, well, you've been very persistent wanting to test and this and that, and now there's a window because we have a tire test next week and we have no driver. So would you come along and drive? You won't get the ride because you don't have the experience, but you can at least sample some IndyCar, experience. So I did that, and I broke the lap record at Phoenix at the time. And then took about a week. I was back in Sweden, and Rick called me up and said, well, we've been reconsidering this, and we want to offer you the ride if you be willing. So that's how it came about. Long story, long answer, but there you go.
It's a great story, and I guess I'm kind of interested in how your kind of perception of ovals and how you felt about them. And I guess you must have felt, well, you can tell us, but you must have felt like you kind of immediately were at home on an oval, because you led a lot of the first oval race that you did, and you were kind of immediately competitive on all of the oval races that you did. And obviously the championship IRL at the time was oval based. So yeah, give us a little bit of a flavor about how you came to find the ovals when you first got over there as something totally new when you'd kind of moved over, I guess.
Yeah, it was new, but I don't know why. Maybe my background, I started driving cars on the ice in Sweden with and really slippery, and I learned how to be smooth. I learned how to car control, and I think my career, if you look at it, you'll see that I've been competitive in all kinds of different cars, if it's race or rally or rallycross or X Games or, so I have I guess I have an ability, or had an ability, to adopt to whatever, I sat in. So it wasn't, I mean, yes, ovals were different. Definitely a lot to learn when it came to car setup. It's very complicated to run an oval. People in Europe think it's just an oval or a few corners, but it's a lot of intricacy that goes into being fast on an oval, because it's very, very scary. It can be, you're battling your own fears. It's like it puts you right on the limit of life, really. So at that point, you have to sort of, I guess, get used to, but in terms of learning how to do it and stuff, it came pretty natural to me, I think.
Yeah, well, it definitely did, because you were winning races pretty quickly, and obviously won the championship in 98 after you switched to Foyt. What do you remember about moving over to AJ's team and working with him? And I guess you must have had some, well, at least a little bit of belief that you could be competitive in 99, because you'd already finished 6th in the 500 the year before and obviously won that championship with AJ. So give us a little bit of a flavour about how that move kind of worked for you and your feelings about that one.
Well, I mean, the first year, I had a lot to learn with Rick, of course, and I also Rick Gallis, and I had a rookie engineer at the time as well. So it was a bit like a blind leading a blind. It wasn't easy. I remember being at Indy that first year. It was like I feared for my life, because the car wasn't behaving like I wanted. It was very erratic, and when you drive at 400 kph and you have between two concrete walls, then erratic is not a good thing. And back then it was a full month here. It wasn't today is a week's testing and then qualifying and then there's a break and the race. Back then it was 4 weeks solid. So there was a lot of time to think about your mortality, I tell you. But in the end of the season, I had made enough of an impression, to gather the interest of AJ Foyt, and he was a larger than life sort of character, and he still is. He's one of the absolute biggest in motor racing, and so when he called, it was kind of unbelievable, a little bit, but he did call and we made a deal, and all of a sudden I had a car that handled, and I got along really well with AJ, because I think although we're very different persons, but we united in the enormous passion for winning, and sort of giving everything to get across the finish line first. I think that was the energy that we shared, and so that spurred the team and the whole group to first win the championship, and then winning the Indy 500. We could have won 2 Indy 500s and we could have won 2 championships. We were really close. We had some mechanical issues, both for running out of fuel at Indy, and a wheel bearing broke when we led the championship in the last race of 99. So it was a very successful partnership, let's say. He became like a racing dad for me. Back in those days, it's not like now where you have 10 engineers and it's all electronically driven. Back then it was tip of the fingertip feeling, and you had to learn how to set up a car and sort of develop a sixth sense, nearly how to get what you needed out of the car, and to work with somebody with that amount of experience was invaluable for me. I learned a lot from him, and if you look at what I've done since racing, I spent 8 years with McLaren developing sports cars in the UK, and that was you can't do that job properly unless you're very technically involved and savvy. And so this type of knowledge is it doesn't happen so much anymore because the sport is different now, but back then it did happen if you paid attention to it.
For sure. I can see what you're saying as well about maybe you and AJ being different characters, but you've obviously, you've lived your whole career through, being desperate to win and having that mentality that winning is everything to you. So I can see how you both would have got on in that sense. Just going back to the 500 in 99 then, what immediately jumps out in terms of your memories from the race? I mean, the way the race played out was quite, I guess some people on the outside would say it looked quite simple, in the sense that you were kind of waiting for a long period of that race to see whether Robbie Gordon was going to run out of fuel with that kind of Hail Mary strategy that he was on. So I mean, give us your sort of memories of the month of May there, and how you came to be an Indy 500 champion in 99.
Well, the thing I remember about it was that at the end of 98 we received the car, the tub that we were going to use for the 500. The car was going to be built around that tub, and so I gathered all the team members around that tub and said this thing's going to win the Indy 500. And so we started sort of thinking about it that way, and practicing pit stops, building the car as meticulously as you could. And I spent quite a lot of time at the speedway, crawling around this place, walking around the track, checking all the bumps, knowing where all the manhole covers were in the grass and inside, and just in case something happened, and you must be there, at speed. So it was an enormous preparation. And for the race, I remember that we were, very fast. And I remember that Robbie, he pitted, I don't remember now, but he was out of the pit window to actually make it to the end. And so we stretched it. I think we needed 4 more extra laps or something. And still that was a stretch. But we stretched it there, and then we knew we had to save fuel to make it to the end. And that's what we did. We saved fuel, and then if 5, 7, 8 laps to go, I was clear to go full rich. And that's when we we just ate into Robbie's lead, seconds a lap, and he was on fumes, of course, hoping for a yellow, but there was no yellow. So we kind of knew that he couldn't go to the end, but of course there's always the possibility that there's a yellow, and then that changes things. So you never know in this race,
Gordon continues to roll.
He does. Slower traffic, but here comes Kenny Brack. Gordon with the lead. Slower traffic. Kenny Brack. Now Gordon's pulling in. He's pulling in. Kenny Brack has got it. Robbie Gordon, we didn't think he could make it. Kenny Brack has picked up the lead. Now with 1 lap remaining, Kenny Brack sees the white flag as he heads into 1.
Kenny Brack smoothly through.
I was listening to the radio interview in Victory Lane a little while back, and it kind of struck me that maybe you just you hadn't registered that you'd won the Indy 500, in the sense that it sounded like you just hadn't kind of registered what you'd just done. And was that the case? And did it take a little while for it to sink in that you just won that race and everything that it meant to put your name on that trophy?
I don't think I ever thought about it as anything else than just another motor race, and that's what it is. It is just another motor race. But I think afterwards, if you and AJ used to say this as well. He always said, if you haven't won the Indy 500, you haven't won anything. That was his sort of belief.
Checkered flags are out, and you name it, a new face will adorn the Borg Warner Trophy as Kenny Brack wins the 83rd Indianapolis 500-mile race.
If I look at my career, I won a lot of races, and I won a lot of championships, and I won in all kinds of different, categories. But people only remember me for 2 things, I believe. And the first thing is, or one thing at least, is the Indy 500. And the other one is a huge accident that I went through. That's the only thing people seem to remember. But obviously, for me, who lived it, I remember a whole lot of other things in between there. But that's how important that race is, for someone's career. I think. So. Yeah, it is a big race, but I never thought about it as any other thing, as just another motor race when I was driving.
One thing it did do was kind of, I guess over a longer period, maybe after the 500, was kind of inspire the Swedish public sort of back into motorsport again, and sort of helped a lot of people to kind of fall in love with motor racing as a sport again. So I guess, if you thought about it in that context, kind of as your career was winding down and thinking about your career, obviously, as you said, you've won a lot more than just the 500. You've won championships and many races over the years. But in many ways, I think a lot of people in Sweden will, thank you and remember you for your achievements and kind of what you did for motorsport in Sweden in terms of the publicity and I guess just kind of shining a light on racing again after maybe a difficult period in Sweden. So have you ever thought about it in that context before?
Well, yes and no, because yes, I think that I became a household name in Sweden because of all the years that I competed and the level I competed at, and the publicity that generated. But I also remember that when I stopped racing, then there was no real sort of energy in Sweden to people didn't know how to create the next driver. So that's what I did with Marcus. I created a project, Marcus Ericsson. I created a project, and it wasn't around Marcus. It was just to create a project to bring the next Swede up. And I raised all the money for a 5 or 6 year period with investors and sponsorship, and I think close to 10 million euros. I believe I raised, and then I found the driver talent, and then set on a journey to try to get somebody else up there. Happened to be Marcus Ericsson, who then went on to Formula One, and then to IndyCar, and he won an Indy 500 a couple of years ago, which was a great achievement for him. Then you have Felix Rosenqvist. I was never really involved with him, but I think it needed a bit of a push, and I tried to give it a bit of a push.
For sure, you must be proud of Marcus and his achievements.
Well, I mean, he's done. He's a good driver. He did great, and winning the Indy 500 means that the project was at least. Did some good,
Yeah, and Felix as well, as you mentioned, is doing a great job this season and having a good time in his new seat at Meyer-Shank. So it's a good time for Swedish drivers. I guess I wanted to ask you about just to kind of conclude the Indy 500 topic really. And you mentioned your crash earlier, and I wondered how much the win at the Indy 500 in 99 was maybe one of the motivating factors for you to come back in 2005. And speaking of the publicity in Sweden and around the motorsport world as well, it was obviously such a big story for you to come back and drive again in 2005. How much of the win in 1999 kind of inspired that, or was it more just down to the fact that you wanted to prove to yourself that you could drive again at the same level? And that whole kind of storyline is a really interesting one for people, I think.
Well, I don't think you can do things like this for the storyline. You're actually, it's hard to explain perhaps, but you're putting your life right on the line. When you do Indy 500 and similar activities, you have to have an inner drive that drives you to do these things. So for me, the comeback was purely driven from a fact of. I wasn't going to let that accident, beat me down. I saw it more like a temporary knockdown. Let's put it that way. Something I could, I was determined to recover from. Of course, I didn't know whether I would ever be able to make a comeback. That was very much in doubt, because I couldn't even. I couldn't even move my legs. I was kind of disabled when I woke up. I broke my back, and all the nerves were damaged. And so when we did the rehab, I worked hard at rehab, and at some point I felt that maybe I could get back in a car. So I got back in a car like 6 months after I got out of the hospital, which was 9 months after the accident, and I think I was a 10th off the lap record in the test, but I didn't have the stamina. The team members had to sort of lift me out of the car, and I hadn't even done like half a race distance. So, but the embryo was born there that, okay, I have the speed. If I just can get the stamina, maybe I could actually make a comeback. And I think the driving factor of all this was that, nobody who's competing wants to be, leave the arena on a stretcher and never come back. So for me, it was important to come back, but it was also important to come back in the right environment because, I had a couple of offers to come back, but they were sort of Indy specific teams, and that's never a good thing. You can't really compete with the big teams if you just do one race a year. So I turned them down because I knew that if I go to do a comeback and I I'm middle of the road, then people will say that, yeah, he was a great driver, but the accident, look, he doesn't have it anymore. So I waited and waited for this opportunity, and Indy started, and I thought I blew it, sort of thing this year. And then my replacement at Rahal Racing at the time, Buddy Rice, he had an accident leading into qualifying, and so he wasn't clear to drive. So Bobby then called me up and said, would you like to come and drive? So in essence, I replaced my replacement. And then we, of course, the car was really good package that year, with the G-Force and the Honda engine. It was a real rocket. I mean, so I got in the car, did a test day or two, and then set the fastest qualifying speed in the whole field. That was the first time in my life that I felt I had won the race before the race had even started. So all I wanted to do, I had already done at that point. So come race day, we were advancing in the field, and it was going good, but unfortunately we had a technical issue with the car, and so we retired. But it didn't matter to me, because I felt everyone knew that I was back. I mean, you could see that from the performance. And so a couple of days later, Paul Newman at the time was partnering with Carl Haas, and he called me and said, look, because their driver crashed in the Indy 500 and broke bones and stuff, so they didn't have a driver for the following weekend at Milwaukee. And they so he said, look, would you like to come and drive with us? But at the time I was so exhausted, I had spent I think 18 months in rehab and trying to get back to racing fitness, and then when you do something and you sort of have a good result, you sort of, all the energy and air leaves you, for a bit, as you get really exhausted, all the hard work sort of really starts to show. And so I turned that down, and I thought about what I was going to do. And then a couple of months after, I decided that this will be the final dot in my IndyCar career. So that's how that was.
It's to be honest, Kenny, it seems like a disservice to only talk about this for half an hour. I could talk to you all day about your career, but I think before you go, we have to ask about the deal that you have with Rahal now and your new role. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what you're going to be doing? And obviously, you're starting at the Indy 500, which is a big race to start your new job. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing with the drivers and the team there.
No, I think in one way it feels like, the film Back to the Future.
Yeah.
But, and somebody yesterday said it was 25 years ago since I won the Indy 500, and that's true, but I have never thought about it until yesterday. But I think what I can do, maybe, if things go well, is to provide a little bit of gray hair in the team, that may be useful in some situations for drivers and the crew alike. That's what I'm hoping, at least. So I'm not having the drivers are the stars, and the team is the star itself. But if you can contribute to it, which is fun and rewarding, especially since I spent a lot of time with this team. We won many races together, and we pole positions. So we were a major force back in the day together. It's lots of history between us, and it's a privilege to be able to come back and be involved a little bit, I think. You never know what life throws at you. I spent 8 years at McLaren developing sports cars, and if you would have asked me last summer when I quit McLaren where I was going to be a year from now, I wouldn't have been able to envision this, but here we are. You never know in life. It circles. goes in circles.
You're a free spirit, Kenny. But I guess what kind of how do you see yourself kind of helping the drivers in the team then on a I mean I know you're not going to be telling them when to change gear and stuff like that, but how do you kind of see how your role is going to help the guys and what you'll be doing with them?
I think it's the whole thing in sports, is the desire to win, but you got to know how to win, and you got to know how to you have to be prepared to put your energy towards winning, and that's not so easy to say, but it's not easy to do. And I think you can perhaps help that process a little bit, help the process of preparation, so that you're prepared to win, because that's the thing. You gotta be prepared to win, and you gotta want it, more than most things in life. If you're going to be successful, it's not easy. And I think you can perhaps help in those situations a little bit, hopefully. But it is there's a lot of things that needs to come from within each individual. You can't. I mean, it's a big team operation. And sometimes pressure can get to you, and sometimes maybe a procedure can be developed. And so I think it's the soft values that you can perhaps add some value if we're lucky.
Kenny, thank you so much for your time. It's been fantastic to have you on the Race IndyCar podcast. We really appreciate it. And we wish you the best for the rest of the month of May, and hope this is a good one with Rahal, Letterman, Lanigan in your reunion together.
Okay.
What does it mean as he takes the sip of milk, the tradition? What does it mean to become a new motorsports hero by winning the Indy 500?
I don't know what it means yet, but I've been practicing drinking milk all week, so maybe that was what did it. I don't know. I got to thank the AJ Foyt Power Team for giving me
Kenny, an absolute gent for making some time with us in a very difficult Indy 500 schedule where rain has impacted things. The teams are all stressed out because they're trying to get the maximum track time on track and maximize what they can do. And fantastic for him to make some time to join us. I feel like we've contextualised 1999 and the period where Kenny Brack won his Indy 500 really well with Matt Beer, and we've obviously heard from the man himself about what that event was like and all of the things surrounding that event that led to other events in his career, and a little bit about his championship win in IRL, his switch to Foyt, giving up on the Formula One dream, I guess, and bouncing back from his crash, and whether 1999 sort of inspired that to a certain extent, which he said it didn't. So that was an interesting one, but it's great to hear from Kenny. And with all that being said, I feel like the only thing we haven't really managed to do so far is to show how Kenny has changed motorsport in Sweden and how much of an important figure he's been for what was arguably a very difficult period after Sweden lost two of its greatest drivers, maybe people falling out of love with motorsport slightly. When Kenny won in 1999, not necessarily knowing so much about the Indy 500 for a lot of fans, and how his win and consequent fame in Sweden inspired a new generation of fans in Sweden. So without further ado, we'll head over to Matthias Persson, a journalist in Sweden and someone who's worked with Felix Rosenqvist since 2007, to tell us a little bit more about Kenny's story and how it impacted motorsport life in Sweden. So hopefully you've enjoyed hearing from Kenny Brack, and this being a very Swedish episode, we had to have another Swedish person on to give us a hand with some of the context and background around 1999 and IndyCar in Sweden as well. So there was no better person to call up than Matthias Persson, who's been with Felix Rosenqvist since 2007, looking after all of his media, lots of plane flights, lots of traveling, lots of bouncing around between tracks over the years, and still working with Felix now, and Linus Lundqvist as well, and quite a few other people. And you've just started your own podcast in Sweden as well, Race Vecka. So welcome, Matthias, to the show, and thanks for joining us. It's going to be interesting talking about Kenny Brack. I know you were quite young at the time in 1999, but still, I'm sure we're going to get some good thoughts from you.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. Great being here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. So I guess going back to 1999, how old were you at the time?
Well, I was 11 at the time, so
okay.
Yeah, relatively young.
But you remember a lot of the kind of context of the event and kind of how it changed things in Sweden. Do you remember much of how the kind of popularity of IndyCar changed? And give us a little bit of background about what you remember from the time and kind of your experiences of that race.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, like I said, I was rather young at the time, so parts of my memories might be, a bit skewed from that. But regardless, I did obviously live here at the time, and I've had this conversation over the years as well with people a bit above my age group as well, and we sort of share the same views that this period, 1999, 2000, was really, really, critical for the IndyCar movement, basically, in Sweden. And that particular race in 1999, I think it's become, bigger in the years since than it actually was when it happened. Because I think in 1999, there wasn't generally there was very little interest, I'd say, in IndyCar racing at the time. I think very few people in the street here knew about the Indy 500 for a start. And when Kenny won that gradually started to change, but I wouldn't say it was an overnight thing, because we also have to remember the time that this was in. This is 1999. Obviously, it's way before social media. Obviously, it's even basically before the internet. Sure, some people had it, but whatever was on there was quite limited if you were lucky enough to get onto that, and certainly. Concerning motorsport in general and IndyCar racing, there was very little to find. So the whole narrative of Kenny winning in 1999 was really dependent on the more, the traditional news media that we had. And I do remember that there were some initial reports of his victory, but I think a lot of people found it hard to judge, at the time. What is this? Why is it so big? Is it big? Mm-hmm. But then what happened afterwards was it started to sort of ripple down, and the general perception of the whole thing grew over the next couple of years, essentially. And in 2000, which is the year after he won, I remember going to actually a local car show that we have in the city, coincidentally where I live, which is the city of Jönköping. We have a big car show each Easter, and Kenny was a star of that show, and he came to sign autographs. I got one, and that's my first interaction really with Kenny Brack, with the sport, and where my personal interests basically started out. And I think I wasn't alone in that. I think a lot of people really started to renew their passion for motorsport in Sweden. We'd had a few decades after the deaths of Ronnie Peterson and Gunnar Nilsson in 1978. They both passed away in 1978, where motor racing had been in a general decline. And around the turn of the century is really where it started to gradually grow back. And Kenny's win was really instrumental in that. I think it's proven how instrumental it was more in the years since than in that actual time. But it was a very interesting moment, and nowadays Kenny is well known to the general public.
It's funny how your career has come full circle, because I guess if Felix Rosenqvist hadn't come to IndyCar, then maybe you wouldn't be so involved in IndyCar now. It's kind of from that autograph to now, it's kind of gone in full circle for you.
Yeah, exactly true. And I suspect we might come into that at a later point here in the podcast, but it is fascinating to see the effects that one person in the effect of Kenny could have on an interest for an entire sport, like IndyCar or IRL as it was in the beginning, and then CART in those years. And then after he left, there was a vacuum again, where I would say very few people really cared about IndyCar. There was no possibility to watch it in Sweden. And then in 2019, when Felix and Marcus joined, we had this big boom again, just out of one or two individuals single-handedly bringing forward a whole nation of interest. So it's been a fascinating journey to see. But I think for a lot of people, certainly my age group and thus Felix and Marcus, etc., Kenny has been super influential, and that 500 win and the years that followed, they were really instrumental to that.
Yeah, we'll definitely get onto Marcus and Felix in a second, but I just want to stick with Kenny just a tiny bit longer. And I guess Marcus and Felix probably would have been in the same situation that Kenny was in '99 had they first come to IndyCar and been the kind of trailblazers from Sweden. They might have found the same kind of slow build up into the popularity building and stuff like that. But I guess I wanted to talk a little bit about Kenny after his career as well, because we talked to him a lot about 1999 and what that race did for his career and his thoughts on it, and also gave some context on CART and the split and where sort of the Indy 500 and IndyCar racing was in 1999. But in the kind of years after, Kenny had a really tumultuous career where obviously finished second in CART and had that enormous crash that a lot of people have seen on YouTube and remember that he was lucky to walk away from. And then in the years following has done all sorts of different things on the automotive side, working with people like McLaren on the automotive side, and he's even been to Goodwood and won races there and done all sorts of stuff. What's Kenny's sort of reputation like in Sweden now? And if he was at that car show again, would he be the main draw again? Is he one of the kind of biggest names in Swedish motorsport still, or would you say Marcus and Felix have kind of taken that over a little bit now?
No, I would certainly suggest Kenny is probably the big household name in Swedish motorsport still. And I mean, his whole narrative, the career that he's had, let's just step back briefly to the year 1999 to 2000. Something that was really important, I would suggest, to the rise of the interest surrounding IndyCar, CART, and Kenny in these years, where there was, after he won in 1999, I think people sort of backtracked the importance of the race, and they started understanding, well, here is the first Swedish winner of this race, which apparently has gone on for near on 100 years. It's probably a big deal. And then, he'd won the championship the year before as well, let's not forget. And in 2000, he signed a deal to race in CART. And a really critical thing was the national host broadcaster that we had, this is public service available for all. They had a show called Race, simply Race, and that aired like midweek highlights of the CART championship from 2000 on, and that was really well produced. It was easy to grasp for the general audience. Everybody could watch it. I think it had close to 1 million viewers, and this was extremely important for the rise of Kenny, and I think that goes hand in hand with the fact that he continued to perform at a very high level in those years. So he'd done himself and he'd done the sport all good things by winning the 500. But if he'd been 18, if he'd won the 500 out of fluke and then he'd gone on to be 18th, 19th in the championship in the years subsequent to that, I think the interest and his popularity and everything would have been nowhere near what it is now, because the big boom of interest happened after he won the 500, and that's when he continued to deliver in 2000. I mean, he was in that championship fight towards the end of the year. In 2001 as well, he was battling for the title, and then on top of that, interest organically grew in those years, and then happened Texas Motor Speedway in 2003 and that big crash, 214G if I'm not mistaken, which is probably the highest G amount ever survived by a human being. And that just added to Kenny's superhero status in the way that he survived that. Not only did he survive it, he actually got back on track in 2005 at the 500 and qualified fastest, although he couldn't start the race at the front for reasons you've probably delved into elsewhere in the podcast. But yeah, it all added to his superhero status. And I think he was quite clever as well in the way he handled media. He's always been super, it's always been very important for him that, competition is not about participation, it's about winning. That's always been his mantra, sort of. And the media really taken that to themselves. And then after he had his crash, that was the second big boom, if you excuse the expression. But when he came back from that, really, that's when he became a big household name, because that was a massive coverage of that. Obviously, that accident was on the front page of all the big magazines and papers that we have here. It was obviously in the news, and by that time, actually, the races were live as well. So I remember watching that race live on telly and watching that crash. Yeah, it was horrible. But when he got back, he was really close to, I wouldn't say superstar, but most people in Sweden probably knew who he was. And that is significant for a motorsport, for a motor racing driver, basically. And so he attended all these, the talk shows. He were on he had his own TV show for a while, even in Sweden. And he really got into that sphere of the other A-list athlete stars of Sweden at the time, and he's really enlisted on that. So a long answer to your question would be that, yeah, I still think Kenny Brack is probably the go-to name, especially for the slightly older generation. So if you do have an average of age in Sweden, and you trip upon your average Swede in the street, and you'd ask them to name one Swedish racing driver, I think the likelihood is big that name is going to be Kenny Brack.
That's really interesting to hear, and it's fascinating to know that his kind of folklore, if you like, has lasted this long and is still on into the present day. And now he's working as a driver advisor for Rahal. It's going to be interesting to see him kind of picking up that, being in the public eye a little bit more in IndyCar than he has been maybe in the past few years. So that's going to be really interesting to see. Let's continue that kind of lineage to the modern times. And we know Marcus Ericsson and Felix Rosenqvist, I should say, were already famous in Sweden, or at least kind of well known to a certain extent before they came to IndyCar. Both through, I guess, Marcus being in Formula One. Obviously, I'm sure that was massive when he made it to Formula One and was able to stay there for as long as he did. And Felix obviously has a lot of big achievements in his career as well, coming to race winning Formula E and winning all of the Formula 3 championships. I'm sure there was some coverage of his kind of rise through the junior ranks, especially, and then switching to IndyCar. But I guess, how do you feel that? I mean, we teased it a little bit earlier on that maybe Marcus and Felix wouldn't have had the same kind of impact or initial kind of recognition in Sweden in terms of IndyCar if Kenny Brack hadn't have been there in the first place and kind of trailblazed that way for him. I know it's always very exciting when a country has a first driver in something like the Indy 500 or a first championship or something like that. We've seen that with Christian Lundgaard from Denmark as well. We've seen them going through that kind of transition. But I very much doubt that IndyCar would have taken hold maybe as quickly as it has recently if Kenny Brack hadn't existed when Marcus and Felix then came over and reignited that passion for IndyCar, let's say.
100%, I agree. I mean, the red carpet was rolled out in a way for them, although it's been 20 years in the making, basically, since Kenny left and they arrived roughly 15. At least IndyCar was in the perception of people. They knew what it was, sort of, because of Kenny. So he really, like you say, he was the big trailblazer. We had Stefan Johansson obviously there as well, but Kenny certainly was the big trailblazer in terms of general perception of IndyCar. And then, even growing up, I am basically exactly the same age as both Felix and Marcus, 1 or 2 years just separating us. So I've grown up in the same Sweden, if you like, and I know these guys as well. And especially with Felix, I've spent a lot of time. And I think it's fair to say, Kenny Brack has probably been their big inspiration for racing heroes. That said, everybody in Sweden will always have the hugest of respect to Ronnie Peterson, and that is obviously a household name still and will probably be forever for his achievements in Formula One. But it should also be remembered, these guys, Felix and Marcus, they were born 10, 12 years after Ronnie passed, so they just can't have any own memories of him. But they certainly can of Kenny, because they were 10, 12, just like myself, when he was at his peak. So really, that's been a name that has been super influential to them for various reasons. I'm sure you've discussed this also probably, but certainly with Marcus, Kenny actually managed Marcus in the early parts of his career, super close, and without Kenny, 100% Marcus wouldn't have been in Formula One, or he wouldn't have been in IndyCar. Kenny was his manager at the time, so early on when he started out in Formula BMW and then into the GP2 years. So obviously he's been very much hands-on in that project as well. But regardless of that, and actually with Linus Lundqvist as well, the third Swede, he's been in touch with Kenny from time and time again for some advice over the last years too. So he's still very much there, and certainly in people's perception, and for the drivers, just to reconnect to your question. When they arrived in IndyCar, that just meant it was a shorter startup for the interest. We could notice that sending out the initial press releases, like we had to make some explanations of what IndyCar was, but generally people knew about it. They knew about the Indy 500 and all that. And again, like what I said in the beginning there, that it's fascinating to see how one person first, when Felix announced he was going there in 19, and then very shortly afterwards Marcus announced he was going there in 19 with Smith Peterson, we had this effect where 1 + 1 = 3 suddenly in terms of interest, and the spike was big to the point where IndyCar hadn't been in anybody's mind. Just looking at myself, I'm probably one of the most nerdy Swedes when it comes to following motor racing. I promise you that. I watch and follow basically everything. I was kind of watching IndyCar, but I don't think a lot of people were before 19 in Sweden. I promise you that. And then from 19, we had this deal where the races are live streamed. All of the races have been ever since, and it's now at a level where the discussion in the motorsport community certainly is on a par with Formula One in Sweden. We don't get the TV numbers from Viaplay, who air both Formula One and IndyCar here, so we can't actually know the figures, and I wouldn't suggest they're above Formula One. But in terms of the motor racing community and the discussions that are had, it's certainly IndyCar that is the dominating headline now, and that is because we obviously have the Swedes, and then that all just increased, obviously, leading up to, Felix had his first win there. He became the first winner since Kenny in 2020 at Road America when he won, and then Marcus won the 500, and they've both been very competitive there in the last couple of years. And now we have this huge influx of Swedes traveling to the races, watching, discussing, and even, they are now front page stuff themselves. On a really good day, a good achievement, you can have them at the front page. Felix was there, Marcus was there when he won the 500, and we are talking national news. The major national news all cover this now. So it's been a super shift, and it's just fascinating to think that this is all happening through 1 or 2 and now 3 individuals, essentially. They can drag on interests for potentially millions of eyeballs, and Kenny was the trailblazer to that, and it's great to see the drivers of the generation that had him as their inspiration now coming up to try and equal and match that. And it's been great to see the interest spike in IndyCar in Sweden over the last 5 years.
So would it be fair to say that Marcus and Felix, people will be following them at the moment? I mean, Marcus obviously has had a bit of a roller coaster start to the season and some bad luck, but I'm sure there's interest in the kind of storyline of him moving to Andretti and Andretti moving to 3 cars and all of the stuff kind of going on there. Marcus being, being paid as a top driver and joining a name like Andretti, I'm sure has grabbed the headlines. And also Felix has been in the top 10 in every race so far since he's moved teams as well. It seems like on paper, it's like the perfect news cycle for Swedish drivers at the moment for IndyCar, with Marcus obviously winning the 500 and then kind of some people feel like maybe being robbed for the second one, potentially winning 2 in a row, and unfortunately for him finishing second. And Felix keeps saying that he believes that he had the best car for the 500 last year and was unfortunate not to be there fighting at the end of the races as well. So how would you kind of gauge, would you say people are kind of getting into, I guess what I'm getting at is Are people following this live and getting interested in some of the kind of background storylines of IndyCar, or is it more kind of focused on watching the races on TV and then kind of discussing them afterwards? I'm interested in how the interest in news kind of works and how people follow the series.
Well, obviously, most people, I would say, watch it live. Not all people can if they don't have the channel, but most people, I'd say they do watch the races live. They discuss them in various forums, and that's a big shift that we've had since Kenny's days. Obviously, now it's much more easy to discuss, and that's in good and bad. I say we do tend to have this camp. I'm sure it's not unique to Sweden. I'm sure you have it in the UK, etc. for your drivers, but in some instances we do have, the Marcus camp, the Felix camp, and for some reason they can't seem to agree that both are relatively good drivers. but I mean, again, it's good. It sort of brings out interest. It brings passion. It's been as far as this year is concerned so far, it's been a little bit hard for Marcus with the results he's had, especially the last two races in Barber and IMS road course. He's quite disappointed with that, and that sort of I think brought down maybe expectations as well for him for the 500, which could be a good thing. You never know. But with Felix, it's a little bit vice versa. He joined on paper one of the smaller teams, and so he went in with lower expectations from the general public, but he's really sort of outperformed that by a lot. So he's now back, I would say, in sort of headlining the discussions surrounding IndyCar at the moment, because people can see they are a genuine threat to these big teams. And also there is quite a lot has been picked up from the fact that Felix and Marcus are, not technically, but indirectly teammates as well. From the technical alliance between Meyer Shank and Andretti there, they are very good friends, of course, off track. So they are sort of in the same camp now. And people like to consume IndyCar, and we do write about it. I mean, the niche motorsport media do write about IndyCar specific features and analysis, but I think the vast majority, at the end of the day, they probably stick to watching the races, discussing it in their forums, and sort of consuming it from the main and not so niche media. But I mean, it's great to even be there. There was a period of time in Swedish motorsport where there was a big taboo after what happened with Peterson, etc. And we've come past that now, and you can see that when Marcus and Felix, just one final example, they've come back home time and again to make some guest appearances in the Porsche Carrera Cup in Sweden. And it's fascinating. I've spoken to the organizers of the event, and they can see a absolute massive spike in ticket sales when the press releases went out that Marcus and Felix were coming back home. And I've been to those races at Mantorp for the season finale, and people are absolutely flooding the paddock, and they're all, hunting for their autographs. And you see little kids almost with tears in their eyes when they see Felix and Marcus, and you can see the parents, wanting to have the picture with the kids and themselves and the drivers, and it's just this kind of superstar effect that Kenny once had. I do see that, we're heading there with them as well, and I think the full story is never told until maybe a few decades later when you see the legacy that triples down from this. But I mean, for the kids of today, probably their superstars will be Marcus Ericsson and Felix Rosenqvist.
I'm sure, like Kenny, as you very expertly explained, that I guess a lot of the interest in, especially Marcus on his achievements, and hopefully Felix when he achieves his 500 win that he's very keen on scoring, that the interest will build kind of in the following years, and that's kind of how motorsport works, right? It's like you kind of in the moment you just move on to the next story, but a few years down the line you're able to appreciate what someone's achieved and what they've done. Matthias, it's been absolutely fantastic having you on the podcast. Thanks so much. It's been fantastic to learn more about how IndyCar is kind of seen in Sweden, and to learn more about it, and even learning about like things like when races are live on TV and stuff. We just take things like that for granted these days, but obviously it wasn't so long ago in terms of decades that the 500 wasn't live in every country, and that you did kind of catch up on it the day after, or in the weeks after, even sometimes, if you were waiting for magazines and things like that to be delivered and all that kind of stuff. So it's fascinating to learn more about that period, and a bit about how it's impacted our current IndyCar stars. I'm sure the Swedish press are enjoying Felix beating his old team, and it's very likely he could have been leading the championship without a couple of issues that he's had. Even though everything's gone fantastically well with all the top tens, he still had quite a few issues in some of the races, like brakes, and the spark plug in St. Pete, I think, was a big issue as well. So yeah, I'm sure they're enjoying that storyline, and Marcus moving to Andretti is obviously massive news. So Matthias, thanks so much for joining us on this episode of the Race IndyCar podcast.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thanks.
We have to say a big thank you to Matthias and to our other guests, Matt Beer and, of course, Kenny Brack, for joining us on this show. I feel like Matthias' section is a really nice way to end this podcast, because, as Kenny pointed out in his interview, he feels like maybe people only remember him for his 1999 Indy 500 win, and also for his, obviously, enormous crash as well. But I think Matthias' section really brings to life how impactful Kenny was as a figure in motorsport in Sweden, not just for aspiring drivers, but for bringing in a new era of fans as well, allowing people in Sweden to fall in love with motorsport again, and giving them the inspiration to do that by winning the Indy 500 and being really successful in a very difficult period, as we found out from Matt Beer, in IRL and CART as well. When he moved there afterwards, it was only a matter of time that he was going to be heading over to CART after his successful performances in IRL. But yeah, really nice to hear how much of a massive impact he had on Marcus Ericsson's career. Kind of a full circle moment with Marcus winning the 2022 Indy 500, and some people will say should have won the 2023 Indy 500 as well. And yeah, a really great opportunity to learn more about that side of things, which is, I feel like, fulfilling Kenny's wish that people see more of his career. I think Matthias has done a really good job of that, of showing us how his career has impacted people in more than just the case of the 1999 win and his crash. That's all for this very special episode of the Race IndyCar podcast.
The Athletic.